Hello, and welcome to my channel Ward Draws a Lot. Obviously I'm Ward, or I wouldn't have named it Ward Draws a Lot. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Rendr sketchbook for you guys. So I've already used this book a good amount, and I actually stopped using it because I don't like it. It's a love-hate relationship with this book because I did some of my best drawings in there, but the Rendr sketchbook itself is very difficult to work with. So, the claim of the Rendr sketchbook is that it is bleed proof, so nothing goes onto the other side of the paper, and that you could use it with all media. So that's like markers, charcoal, pencil, paint, liners, anything. Now, the paper itself feels a little weird. It's almost like it's double laminated on both sides, making the paper extremely slippery and hard to almost work with. I've had smooth paper that I've worked with, especially over the last year or two, but this is almost like you could slide water off of this paper. I used mostly markers, or actually genuinely all markers, and I used Posca paint pens when I was working in this sketchbook. And I had a lot of issues when I was working with this sketchbook. I made it work. I tried the best I can, because when you buy a supply, you're gonna try your hardest to make it work no matter what. Did the paper do what it was advertised to do, which is not bleed through on both sides? Yes, it did that. It did not bleed at all in any way, in any page, any form. That's what I'm doing all these hand gestures for. I'm showing you how the page before would have a lot of ink and it would just be this huge drawing, but nothing on the other side. And that was what was so great with this, is that you could use every single page to your advantage, feel like you're getting your money's worth, and overall have a great time because you feel like you're doing not only great artwork, but you're saving money. But, and this is a big but, there is a cost to using the paper, which is an extreme learning curve. So, what do I mean by that? First off, before I even continue, let me just say that this is my experience with this book and how I felt working with it. If it was great for you, that's awesome. It was alright with me, but this is just my review and how I look at it. So I'm going to be using my Ohuhu markers to show you how the ink laid down on this paper, because that always kind of shocked me, or like hit me by surprise, and I think it has to do, or it has something to do with the fact that it is laminated on both sides. So I took the marker R1 and I made a little circle on the Rendr sketchbook paper, and then a little circle on the cardstock paper next to the R1. I feel like the R1, once it's put down at first, is extremely dark compared to the R1 on the cardstock paper. It feels like it's almost a shade darker, or even 2 shades if you want to go that far. And then over time, it begins to lighten up. And that always messed with my head, because when you're coloring something, you want it to be the same color throughout so you could see how you're blending it and how it looks as you're working on the piece. So I went to G1 next, and I did the same thing. I made a little green circle in the Rendr sketchbook paper and compared it to the cardstock version, and I did that for the first row of colors just to show how different they might look once they're first put down on the Rendr sketchbook paper and then on the cardstock paper. Again, they lighten up over time, but that's over time, not when you're working on it. Next, I want to show you the blendability of this paper, which I'm not a fan of. I took 2 very like greens and I tested out how they would blend together. And I went back and forth just to make sure that it did blend out nice and smooth, because I do a lot of blending in my art pieces. And the 2 greens didn't do so bad. They looked like a little nice gradient, but that's only because those 2 colors were extremely similar to each other. So there wasn't really a line of blend, I'm gonna call it here, which is a weird in-between meat of where the colors come together. I tried it again with 2 yellows that were a little different from each other. You could tell that they're both yellow, but one is a little darker and one is a little lighter. Then I took 2 completely different colors and it was like a lime green and almost like a highlighter-ish pink, and I tried to mix them together. Now obviously this one is going to have some difficulty just because they're two different colors, but the way they mixed together was not nice at all. And I went back and forth and I blended a lot because I like blending. And once I let them dry, which you can tell they're lighter now than when I first put them down, you could see that there's the line of blend there, which is like this weird part in the middle of the blend that doesn't mix together. It almost like kind of just looks like it was moved back and forth. And that's because when you lay ink down on this paper, it doesn't absorb into the paper until it is dry. So when you first put the ink down, it sits on the paper until it is moved by the brush strokes that you create. And it just doesn't absorb. It just doesn't go through the paper. I've tested this so many times. This affects liners too, because once you place the liner down and you just run your finger over it, it smudges right away. But if you give it a minute and you just let it sit there, it absorbs into the paper. So you have to wait for your line art to dry if you're gonna go in with a marker or color it right after. But it sucks because you have to work extremely fast with this paper. So like with this drawing right here, I didn't work fast enough, and I'm a quick blender. I go back and forth pretty quickly, I learned. And the blend just doesn't go through nicely. It kind of just meshes together and doesn't look like it's blended, and it almost just kind of makes a line of gradient with each kind of color, and it just doesn't look nice to me. And I try to use more ink so this way I could blend it better, but it just doesn't work. Instead, this paper drinks ink like it's water, and you sit there and you're like, bro, I'm wasting so much ink for nothing because it's not going anywhere. It's not absorbing into the paper. So I had to change my coloring style. I had to start layering the colors on top, like I did with this drawing right here, instead of actually blending the colors together. I had to completely change my style of how I think drawings look nice and just completely switch to just like a cell shading effect, which cell shading looks very nice, but I preferred blending because I bought markers which their job is to blend. So like I can't even use the supply that I bought and use it for its job because the paper refuses to work with me. So I also tested the marker over the liner ink, and it smudged. When it was with one layer, it was fine. When it was with multiple layers, it was starting to give out on me and just smudge everywhere. This paper is also extremely hard to sketch on. It is extremely slippery, along with the fact that it is very hard to erase once you've drawn something on this paper. I have to erase super hard, but you can't overwork the paper because then the ink is going to sit even funnier than it already does, and it's like a give and take situation, and you're sitting there like, bro, what do I do? And you just tell yourself, like, I have to adjust to this book. I already bought it, and I don't want to waste my money because art supplies are expensive, but at the same time, you don't want to put out work that you don't think looks good, so now you're stuck in this like in-between zone of like, dude, what do I do? Do I get another sketchbook? Do I just like tough it out and finish this one? It's like almost like a difficult artist path thing, and I'm gonna just be real with y'all. I gave up on the book. I was like, I'm not gonna put myself through this because I don't like what's coming out. Granted, the drawings were great, some of them, and like they're like some of the best things that I've done, but that's because my skill got better. But they would have looked even better if it was on supplies that worked nicely. So I'm going to show you how this book works, almost. The arm that I'm coloring right now, I'm using a light hand. I'm trying to be very delicate, use nice soft strokes, and use a color or colors that transition nicely between each other. And I'm blending it out because I want to try and see if I could try and blend these colors out and make a nice soft gradient. And I tried to achieve that, but it still left hard lines. Now this is something I don't strive for in my work. I prefer you see no lines and there's a beautiful gradient because again, these are blending markers, but that didn't really happen with that arm. So moving on to the second arm, I used a heavier hand purposefully, because not everybody draws and colors lightly. Some people have like a really heavy touch whenever they draw, and that's okay. People just do things differently. And it was even harder to blend because I used a heavier touch. So you're gonna definitely have to work on your pressure sensitivity whenever you work on this paper or buy this book. Keep in mind, I'm using a brush tip this whole time for the arms because that's supposed to make blending easier, and it does. So now for the chest part of the sweater, I used a chisel tip because not everybody has the capability to get brush tip markers, even if they are Uhuhu. So with the chisel tip, it's the same thing. It's if you lay down the color and you try and blend it out, it's gonna look alright, but it's gonna still leave your harsh lines. Even if you go back and forth and you try and blend it, it's still gonna end up looking a little strange. And I think that has to do with the fact that if you lay down one layer of color, it looks very light. Second layer, it gets extremely dark, then even darker, and then on and on. So you're gonna get almost like a highlight, which is cool, which is, I liked doing that. That was like my favorite part of probably the sketchbook, is that it gave itself a highlight, and I didn't have to worry about working around that and leaving a space for it and everything. Same thing happened with the pants. It's just, there's always going to be the weird gradient line, and the color, again, compared to when it looks like what it dries versus when it's put down, the color is very dark and the ink is very different, and I feel like you could definitely see that when I color the skin in a second. But before I colored the skin, I was like, bro, why is there so much bleeding? And I had completely forgot that the ink bleeds like crazy on this paper because it's just being moved around and then soaked in compared to just being soaked in the first place. So I went to the side and was like, okay, let's just test out how much it bleeds by drawing a circle and then coloring within the circle. The first circle was just one layer of color, and I made sure I didn't blend and try and color outside the line. If I did, then it was probably an accident, or it probably bled after I laid it down. And the first one layer circle did pretty fine. So then I made another circle, and I was like, okay, let's blend within this circle, because realistically, that's what a lot of people want to do, is blend. So I go in with the darker color, and I make the little gradient, and I go back and forth with the lighter and the darker color, and try and keep it within the circle. But it still ended up bleeding. The ink would push down on the paper instead of absorb, and just slide everywhere, causing it to like have a blurry line effect around the circle, which you don't want your ink to get past your liner unless you like coloring outside the lines, which if you do, great, that's good for you. So I made a third circle, and this time I went in with a different color. I went in with some blues that weren't too far off because they're still in the same color family, and I did the same technique. I laid down the darker color and then I blended it out back and forth, and then it still ended up bleeding. And at that point I was like, maybe it's me, maybe I'm blending too much, but it doesn't make any sense because you have to go back and forth with markers in order to blend them. So afterwards I saw that it left the little line of gradient there too. Again, it just keeps happening, it doesn't go away. Other paper kind of just smoothly disappears, but that one it didn't. So I go in to like color the skin, and you'll see how dark it is once it's laid down. It's like really dark, and then over time it lightens up because I chose a warm gray color. It's like WG1, and it's purposefully really light. Now compare the way the stomach looks once it starts to dry to the face once I start laying down the ink, and that is a pretty significant color difference. Now, you can get used to that. You could just train your eye as to say, okay, this is going to look like this after a few minutes, or like after a minute, and you know, you could work around that. But I personally like seeing the color as is once it's laid down, so this way I can work with it correctly. I don't want to like confuse myself if I'm using a color that is already darker, and if I'm placing it in a certain area, it would just confuse me. And this happened with every single drawing I did in the book. Overall, this sketchbook paper isn't the worst on earth. There's probably way worse out there, and maybe I'm just really picky, which I think I kinda am, I'm not gonna lie to you. But like, if you want blendable nice paper that works great, I don't think this paper is that if you want to do cell shading with this paper, it would work fantastic because you're not blending a lot. Otherwise, maybe get a different sketchbook. So, thanks for watching, and I love you. Remember that.